Jake Morrison stopped mid-stride, his weathered hand frozen on Thunder's harness as the massive Brahman bull's deep bellow shattered the morning calm of Gate C-14. In 6 years of partnership, he'd never heard Thunder cry. It wasn't the sharp bark of detection or the rumbling warning of danger. It was pure, heart-wrenching anguish that seemed to tear from the bull's very soul. Passengers scattered like startled birds, coffee cups crashing to polished floors as Thunder's wound 200-pound frame trembled before an abandoned Navy suitcase. A child's scream pierced the air. Security alarms wailed. The intercom crackled with panicked announcements. Margaret Thompson dropped her mop, tears streaming down her face as she watched the gentle giant who brought her daily joy, now convulsing with grief. Across the terminal, Harold Wilson's wheelchair stopped rolling, his Vietnam-scarred hands shaking as memories of similar moments flooded back. "All units to C-14 now!" Jake's voice cracked into his radio, but his eyes never left Thunder's face. What could make a bull weep? And why did Jake's blood turn to ice at the sight? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 years ago, Jake Morrison had been standing on the edge of the Reunion Tower's observation deck, calculating whether the fall would finally silence the screams that echoed in his head every night. His son David's laughter, the screeching tires, the silence that followed. Then Thunder had found him, not metaphorically, literally. The massive Brahman bull had somehow escaped his transport trailer at the livestock auction below and wandered into the building's lobby, causing such chaos that Jake was forced down from the roof to help with crowd control. One look into those deep, knowing eyes, and Jake understood he wasn't the only soul carrying unbearable weight. Thunder had been rescued from a failed ranch operation in East Texas, where investigators found evidence of illegal activities but never quite pieced together the full picture. The bull showed unusual intelligence and an uncanny ability to detect chemical signatures, explosives, drugs, fear itself. When the experimental security program at Dallas-Fort Worth International needed a candidate for their unconventional detection unit, Thunder became an unlikely recruit. The partnership worked better than anyone expected. Thunder's success rate hit 99.7%, far exceeding traditional K-9 units. But success came with a price tag that made airport administrators wince: $500 daily for specialized care, custom cooling systems, veterinary costs, and liability insurance. Every board meeting became a battle to justify Thunder's existence. Margaret Thompson understood that battle intimately. At 62, she'd spent the last 5 years learning that society had little use for people like her. Widows whose children lived busy lives in distant cities, whose Social Security barely covered rent, whose loneliness had become so familiar it felt like a constant companion. Until Thunder arrived. The gentle giant who remembered her name, who nudged her shoulder when she cried over George's photograph, who somehow made the endless airport corridors feel less empty. She wasn't Thunder's only devotee. Harold Gramps Wilson, 78 years old and abandoned in a VA nursing home until he'd applied for the airport's part-time wheelchair attendant position, had found renewed purpose in their morning conversations. Harold would share his black coffee and war stories with Thunder, who listened with the patience of a confessor, his massive head resting against the old veteran's frail shoulder. But now the board had issued an ultimatum: 48 hours to prove Thunder's value or face immediate termination. The vote had been unanimous. The bull was a liability they could no longer afford. Public criticism had mounted. Social media mocked the airport's expensive pet, while taxpayer advocacy groups demanded answers about frivolous spending. Jake had tried everything. Veterinary reports confirming Thunder's health. Performance statistics highlighting his detection record. cost-benefit analyses proving his worth. None of it mattered to accountants who saw only red ink and liability exposure. As Wednesday morning's chaos erupted around Gate C-14, Jake realized their time had run out. Whatever Thunder had found in that suitcase, whatever had triggered his unprecedented emotional breakdown, it would either save them all or destroy the last family Jake had left. The navy blue Samsonite sat innocuously beside the trash bin at Gate C-14, indistinguishable from thousands of other pieces of luggage that passed through Dallas-Fort Worth International daily. But Thunder's reaction transformed the ordinary into something catastrophic. His massive frame shook with such violence that Jake feared the bull might collapse from the intensity of whatever emotion had seized him. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, but his own voice trembled. In 6 years together, he'd seen Thunder alert to everything from hidden explosives to concealed drugs. But this was different. This was personal. The deep, mournful sounds coming from Thunder's throat weren't the sharp barks of professional detection. They were the keening wails of a creature in profound emotional distress. Actual tears streamed down the bull's graying muzzle, cutting tracks through the dust and leaving Jake speechless. The terminal erupted into controlled chaos. Passengers fled in every direction, some screaming, others filming with their phones. A businessman's laptop crashed to the floor as he stumbled backward. A mother scooped up her toddler and ran toward the nearest exit. Coffee splattered across polished marble floors, and the sweet scent of pastries from nearby vendors mixed with the acrid smell of fear-induced sweat. Security personnel converged from every direction, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Terminal C, Gate 14, possible security threat. Evacuating passengers. Request bomb squad immediate response. But even as protocol kicked into motion, Jake noticed something in the faces around him. Confusion mixed with recognition. This wasn't standard operating procedure because Thunder had never behaved this way before. Margaret Thompson appeared at Jake's elbow, her mop and bucket forgotten. Her weathered face was pale, but her eyes held a sharp intelligence that most people missed. "Jake," she said quietly, "I've been cleaning this airport for 12 years. I've seen patterns, missing child reports, abandoned luggage, strange incidents that never quite get explained." She gestured toward Thunder, who had now positioned himself like a sentinel beside the suitcase. "He's not detecting a bomb. He's detecting something much worse." From across the terminal, Harold Wilson's wheelchair rolled closer, the old veteran's hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. "Son," he called to Jake, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too much in too many wars. "I've been working here part-time for 3 years. This isn't the first time I've seen unusual behavior around abandoned bags. Back in '75, when I first got out of the service, I worked security here briefly. We had incidents then, too. Strange alerts, missing persons reports, things that got swept under the rug." The bomb squad arrived in record time, their equipment cases clattering across the floor as they set up their perimeter. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with steady hands and steady nerves, ran his sensors over the Samsonite while Thunder maintained his vigil. The readings came back clean, no explosives, no chemical signatures that would indicate traditional threats. "It's clean," Rodriguez announced, but his voice carried uncertainty. He glanced at Thunder, who hadn't moved from his protective position. "What's got into him? In 15 years of bomb disposal, I've never seen an animal react like this to a clean bag." Jake's instincts screamed that Thunder knew something they didn't. The bull's behavior wasn't random or emotional breakdown. It was communication, desperate, urgent communication that none of them were understanding. "Open it," Jake said suddenly, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Rodriguez hesitated. Protocol demanded they wait for full hazmat clearance, run additional tests, document everything methodically. But something in Jake's tone, or perhaps in Thunder's continued distress, made him reach for the zipper. The suitcase opened like a mouth revealing its secret. Inside, curled in a nest of fabric softener-scented clothes, lay a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, unconscious but breathing in shallow, rapid gasps that barely moved her tiny chest. Brown curls matted with sweat framed a face that should have been playing with dolls instead of lying motionless in a piece of luggage. Pink pajamas decorated with unicorns seemed to mock the horror of her situation. On her wrist, a hospital bracelet read "Patient Number 7" in neat black letters. No name, no family information, just a number that reduced a child to inventory. The moment stretched impossibly long as trained professionals struggled to process what they were seeing. Then Thunder moved with surprising gentleness for such a massive creature. Before anyone could stop him, he lowered his great head toward the suitcase and began cleaning the child's face with his tongue, the same careful attention he might show to a newborn calf. The little girl stirred at Thunder's touch, her eyelids fluttering. When they opened, revealing eyes the color of summer sky, she looked directly at Thunder and whispered a single word that froze everyone in place. Moo moo. Recognition. She knew him. Somehow, impossibly, this trafficked child knew Thunder. And he had been searching for her. The word moo moo hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything. Margaret Thompson's hands flew to her mouth as pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling for years suddenly clicked into place. Her voice, when she found it, carried the authority of someone accustomed to analyzing criminal patterns. "Jake, I need to tell you something," she said, pulling him aside as paramedics carefully lifted the little girl from the suitcase. "I wasn't always a janitor. I retired from the FBI 12 years ago, Behavioral Analysis Unit. I've been watching Thunder's alerts for 3 years, and I've been tracking missing children reports that correlate with his behavior." Jake stared at her, seeing Margaret Thompson clearly for the first time. The sharp intelligence in her eyes, the way she moved through the airport observing everything, the questions she asked that always seemed just a little too insightful for a cleaning lady. "You've been investigating this?" "Not officially," Margaret admitted, "but Thunder has shown unusual behavior 23 times in the past 3 years. Every single incident involved abandoned luggage. Every single incident was written off as false positive or equipment malfunction. But I pulled missing children reports from those same dates, same airports." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Jake, children went missing within 48 hours of every one of Thunder's alerts." Harold Wilson had maneuvered his wheelchair closer, his weathered face grave with memory. "Son, I told you I remembered similar incidents from the 70s. What I didn't tell you was that I tried to report patterns back then, too. Got told to mind my own business, that I was seeing conspiracies where none existed, but I kept records." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn notebook. 49 years of watching, Jake. 49 years of seeing children go missing and being told it was coincidence. The little girl, patient number 7, was conscious now but silent, clinging to Thunder's massive head as if he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. When paramedics tried to examine her, she screamed until Thunder positioned himself where she could maintain contact. Only then would she allow medical attention. FBI agent Sarah Chen arrived with a team that moved like a well-oiled machine, but even their professional composure cracked when they saw Thunder gently comforting the trafficked child. Chen, a 20-year veteran of crimes against children, had never seen anything like the bond between the bull and the victim. "The hospital bracelet indicates systematic operation," Chen explained to Jake. "Patient numbers suggest multiple victims, medical monitoring, probably pharmaceutical sedation for transport. This isn't opportunistic kidnapping, this is organized long-term, high-volume trafficking." As they spoke, Thunder's behavior provided more clues. When Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived, a respected child psychologist who'd been called to help with trauma assessment, Thunder's entire demeanor changed. The gentle giant who'd been tenderly caring for the little girl suddenly became aggressive, positioning himself between the doctor and the child, his massive frame radiating menace. Interesting reaction, Dr. Vasquez noted clinically, but something in her tone made Jake's skin crawl. Animals sometimes have unpredictable responses to trauma situations. Perhaps the bull should be removed so we can properly assess the child. No! The little girl's first clear word since "moo moo" came out as a shriek of terror. She buried her face against Thunder's neck, her small body shaking with panic at the suggestion of separation. Margaret stepped forward, her FBI training overriding years of janitorial deference. "Dr. Vasquez, I notice you're not on the standard response list for airport incidents. How did you know to come here?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Dr. Vasquez's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "I volunteer with several trauma response organizations. When children are involved, I make myself available." "Convenient," Harold muttered, his notebook still open in his lap. "Dr. Vasquez, would you mind if an old man asked you something? Do you remember consulting on a case in 1975? Young boy disappeared from this very airport?" The color drained from Dr. Vasquez's face so quickly that even Agent Chen noticed. "I think there's been some confusion. I wasn't practicing in 1975. "No," Harold agreed, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "But your late husband was Dr. Miguel Vasquez, head of pediatric psychology at Dallas Presbyterian. The same Dr. Vasquez who owned a ranch in East Texas where cattle were used for experimental therapy programs." The pieces crashed together with devastating clarity. Thunder hadn't been rescued from a failed ranch operation, he'd been rescued from a trafficking operation. The bull's exceptional intelligence hadn't been trained into him, it had been learned through trauma, through witnessing children being moved like cargo, through forming emotional bonds with victims who needed comfort in their darkest moments. Dr. Vasquez's mask finally slipped completely. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," she said, her voice now stripped of its professional warmth. "These children need homes, stable homes with families who can provide for them properly. The biological parents were inadequate, drug addicts, neglectful, abusive. We saved them. By stuffing them in suitcases," Jake's voice cracked with rage and disbelief. "By whatever means necessary," Dr. Vasquez replied with chilling calm. "Do you know how many children die in foster care every year? How many are failed by a system that's supposed to protect them? We place them with carefully vetted families, wealthy families who can give them opportunities they'd never have otherwise." Thunder's low rumble filled the silence that followed, a sound that spoke of recognition, of memory, of justice finally beginning to surface after years of buried truth. The little girl in his care looked up at him with eyes that held both terror and hope, and whispered the words that would bring an entire network crashing down. "Moo Moo knows where they are. Moo Moo knows where my friends are." The little girl's words triggered a chain reaction that transformed Gate C-14 into the epicenter of the largest child trafficking investigation in Texas history. Agent Chen immediately placed Dr. Vasquez under surveillance while maintaining the pretense of normal procedure. But Jake could see the calculation in the doctor's eyes. She was planning her escape. Thunder's past began unraveling through the testimony of patient number 7, whose real name, they learned, was Emma Collins. She'd been missing from Tulsa for 8 months, during which time she'd been held at various locations, including the East Texas ranch where Thunder had lived before his rescue. As Emma spoke in halting whispers, always maintaining physical contact with Thunder, a horrifying picture emerged of systematic abuse disguised as therapeutic care. "The bad lady said Moo Moo was sick," Emma explained, her small hand buried in Thunder's coarse hair. She said he missed the children too much. That's why he cried all the time. She was going to make him go to sleep forever, but the good men came and took him away. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized Thunder hadn't been rescued. He'd been removed as a witness. Someone in law enforcement had unknowingly saved the bull's life while dismantling what they thought was just another failed agricultural operation. The trafficking network had simply relocated, evolving their methods, while Thunder carried the trauma of what he'd witnessed. Margaret's FBI instincts kicked into overdrive as she coordinated with Agent Chen to pull years of records. The pattern became undeniable once they knew what to look for. 23 airports, 47 missing children, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent adoption fees. And at the center of it all, Dr. Elena Vasquez's New Beginnings for Children charity, which had operated with impeccable credentials and glowing testimonials for over 15 years. Harold Wilson's notebook proved invaluable, containing details that official reports had sanitized or ignored. His meticulous record-keeping revealed that the operation had been running since at least 1975, with Dr. Vasquez inheriting control after her husband's convenient death in a ranch accident, an accident that Thunder had somehow survived and remembered. "The old bull never forgot," Harold said quietly, watching Thunder comfort Emma. "Animals don't lie to themselves like people do." He knew evil when he smelled it, and he never stopped fighting it. But the investigation took a devastating personal turn when Agent Chen pulled Jake aside with information that made his knees buckle. "Jake, I need you to sit down. We've been cross-referencing missing children reports with Dr. Vasquez's patient records, and we found something. Your son David, his disappearance 12 years ago, it wasn't a car accident." The world tilted sideways as Chen showed him David's file from Dr. Vasquez's encrypted records, patient number 1, the first victim in a refined system that would eventually claim hundreds of children. David hadn't died in the twisted metal of a car crash. He'd been taken, processed, sold to a family whose wealth could provide everything except legitimacy. "He's alive, Jake," Chen said gently. "We think he's alive. The records show he was placed with a family in Montana. He'd be 20 now." Jake's emotional breakdown was witnessed by half of Terminal C, but nobody looked away. Thunder seemed to sense his handler's anguish and moved carefully to position himself where Jake could lean against his massive frame. The bull's presence provided the stability Jake needed to absorb the impossible truth that his grief, his guilt, his 12 years of self-destruction had been built on lies. The airport community that had gathered around Thunder over the years now rallied with fierce determination. Margaret organized the cleaning staff to monitor every entrance and exit, ensuring Dr. Vasquez couldn't slip away unnoticed. Harold mobilized a network of veterans who'd found purpose in part-time airport jobs, creating an informal surveillance system that covered areas official security might miss. The public response was immediate and overwhelming once news broke about Thunder's true role in exposing the trafficking network. Social media exploded with support for the bull who'd been fighting child traffickers while bureaucrats worried about his operating costs. The GoFundMe, established to save Thunder's job, reached $200,000 in 6 hours, with donations pouring in from around the world. But Dr. Vasquez's network was vast and well-connected. Within hours of her exposure, Jake received anonymous threats warning him to control his animal or face consequences. Margaret's apartment was burglarized, though nothing was taken. A clear intimidation tactic. Harold found his wheelchair tampered with, the brakes loosened in a way that could have caused a fatal accident. Most concerning was Thunder's declining health. The emotional stress of reliving his trauma, combined with what appeared to be mild poisoning from contaminated feed, left the massive bull weakened and vulnerable. Veterinary tests revealed traces of sedatives in his system, the same compounds found in Emma's blood work. The airport board, faced with massive public pressure and media attention, reversed their termination decision with embarrassing speed. Board Chairman Robert Hayes appeared at a hastily arranged press conference to praise Thunder's invaluable service and announce enhanced funding for the animal security program. But Jake knew the real fight was just beginning. Dr. Vasquez's operation had been preparing for exposure for years. Financial records showed shell companies in 12 countries, property holdings across 4 states, and a client list that included some of the wealthiest families in America. These weren't desperate people seeking any child. They were affluent couples who wanted specific types of children and were willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed results. The scope of the conspiracy became clear when Agent Chen revealed that several highly placed officials had been receiving payments from Dr. Vasquez's charity. Airport security supervisors, child protective services administrators, family court judges, all had been compromised through carefully crafted corruption that had allowed the network to operate with near impunity. Emma's continued testimony, delivered in whispers while clinging to Thunder, revealed the systematic nature of the operation. Children were taken based on detailed profiles: age, appearance, intelligence, family instability. They were held at various facilities where they underwent conditioning designed to make them compliant and grateful for placement with their new families. Those who resisted faced psychological punishment that left lasting trauma. "The lady said I was lucky," Emma told Agent Chen during one of her interviews. "She said my real mommy didn't want me anymore, that's why I was going to a better family. But Moo Moo knew it wasn't true. He was sad like me." Thunder's emotional intelligence became the key to unlocking more evidence. When shown photographs of various suspects and locations, the bull's reactions provided investigators with leads that human witnesses couldn't offer. His recognition responses were so accurate that prosecutors began building cases around what they termed animal behavioral evidence. As Thursday dawned, the investigation had identified 12 children currently in transit through the network. Dr. Vasquez had been taken into custody, but her arrest had triggered emergency protocols within her organization. Children were being moved rapidly toward final placement, while evidence was being destroyed systematically. The race against time intensified when intercepts revealed that Thunder himself had become a target. The network's international clients were demanding refunds for disrupted placements, and Dr. Vasquez's associates blamed the bull for the entire collapse. Plans were in motion to eliminate Thunder permanently, disguised as a veterinary emergency that would appear natural given his recent health issues. Jake faced an impossible choice: keep Thunder at the airport where he was vulnerable but could continue providing evidence, or evacuate him to safety while potentially allowing trafficked children to disappear forever. The decision was made when Emma, now speaking more freely but still requiring Thunder's presence for emotional support, revealed the location where other children were being held. "The place with the crying cows," she said, her small voice barely audible, "where they keep the sad children until the new mommies and daddies come. Moo Moo's friends are still there, waiting for someone to find them." Thunder's reaction to Emma's description was immediate and heartbreaking, deep, mournful calls that echoed through the terminal like a lament for all the children he'd been unable to save. His trauma had become their salvation, his memory their only hope for rescue. As federal agents prepared to raid the compound Emma had described, Jake realized that Thunder's 6 years at the airport hadn't been about detecting threats to travelers. They'd been about healing from his own trauma while remaining vigilant for the children he'd been forced to leave behind. Every false alert, every moment of unusual behavior, every instance of what officials had called malfunction had been Thunder desperately trying to communicate what he knew. The approaching confrontation would test whether their unlikely partnership, a broken man and a traumatized bull, could finally bring justice to the children who'd been waiting in darkness for someone to hear their silent screams. The compound sat hidden in the East Texas pine forest like a cancer disguised as healing, its pastoral facade masking horrors that would haunt investigators for years to come. As federal agents surrounded the property at dawn, Jake insisted on bringing Thunder despite the obvious dangers. The bull's behavioral evidence had been crucial in obtaining warrants, and Emma's testimony suggested other children might only trust someone Thunder vouched for. Agent Chen coordinated the assault from a mobile command center while Jake and Thunder waited in a specialized transport trailer monitoring communications through headsets. The property sprawled across 200 acres, with multiple buildings that aerial reconnaissance had identified as potential holding facilities. Intelligence suggested 12 children were currently on site, ranging in age from 4 to 15. The first breach came at the main ranch house where Dr. Vasquez's associates had barricaded themselves with what appeared to be accounting records and computer equipment. Gunfire erupted immediately, forcing tactical teams to adapt their approach. But it was the secondary buildings that revealed the true scope of the operation's cruelty. In converted barn structures, agents found facilities that defied comprehension. Medical examination rooms equipped for sedation and psychological evaluation, dormitories with locks on the outside of doors, playrooms filled with toys and educational materials designed to normalize captivity for young minds. Most disturbing were the therapy rooms where children had been subjected to systematic conditioning designed to make them grateful for their eventual placement with paying families. Thunder's reaction to approaching the compound was immediate and visceral. The massive bull began the same mournful calling that had alerted authorities at the airport, but now Jake understood it was recognition rather than detection. This was where Thunder had lived, where he'd witnessed unspeakable acts, where his unusual intelligence had been shaped by trauma and helplessness. The children they found were in various states of physical and psychological condition. Some had been recent acquisitions, still fighting against their captivity with the fierce resistance of the newly broken. Others showed signs of long-term conditioning, responding to adult authority with trained compliance that spoke of months or years of psychological manipulation. All of them were terrified of the armed agents who'd come to rescue them. That's when Thunder proved his true worth. As Jake led the bull carefully into the compound, staying well clear of the tactical operations, the children's reactions transformed everything. A boy who'd been catatonic since the breach suddenly looked up at Thunder's approach. A girl who'd been screaming inconsolably fell silent. One by one, children began emerging from hiding places that agents hadn't even discovered. "Moo came back," whispered a teenager who'd been reported missing from Houston 6 months earlier. "I told them you'd come back." The reunion between Thunder and the children revealed the depth of bonds that had formed during their shared captivity. The bull moved among them with infinite gentleness, allowing small hands to touch his face, his sides, his massive shoulders. Children who couldn't speak to human rescuers found their voices to murmur comfort to the animal who'd shared their trauma. But the compound held more secrets than just the current victims. In a concrete basement that agents almost missed, they discovered files dating back 30 years. Dr. Vasquez's network had been operating since the late 1970s, evolving from small-scale local kidnappings to an international trafficking enterprise that had processed over 300 children. The records were meticulous, tracking victims from acquisition through placement, including follow-up reports on their adaptation to new families. Jake's world collapsed completely when Agent Chen found David's file among the oldest records. Patient number 1 hadn't just been the first victim of Dr. Vasquez's refined system. He'd been the test case that proved wealthy families would pay extraordinary sums for children who met specific criteria. David had been sold to a ranching family in Montana for $400,000, his death carefully staged to prevent investigation. The file contained photographs that made Jake's hands shake uncontrollably. David, at age 8, recently captured and undergoing psychological evaluation. David at 9, being prepared for placement with the family who'd requested a son to inherit the ranch. Most devastating were the progress reports showing David's gradual acceptance of his new identity, his adaptation to calling strangers mom and dad, his apparent contentment in a life built on a foundation of stolen childhood. Thunder seemed to sense Jake's anguish and positioned himself between his handler and the agents who were trying to process the evidence. The bull's massive presence provided the physical support Jake needed to remain standing as Chen delivered the news that would change everything. "Jake, we've located David. He's alive, he's healthy, and he's been living as Daniel Patterson for the past 12 years. But there's something you need to understand before we make contact. According to his psychological profiles, he believes his birth parents abandoned him. Dr. Vasquez convinced him that his original family didn't want him, that the placement was a rescue rather than a kidnapping. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly when secondary teams discovered evidence of a planned evacuation. Dr. Vasquez's network had anticipated eventual exposure and maintained escape protocols that included elimination of evidence, both documentary and human. Intercepted communications revealed that international clients were demanding the destruction of anything that could link them to the operation. Most terrifying was the discovery that Thunder himself had been marked for elimination. Veterinary records showed that Dr. Vasquez had been slowly poisoning the bull during his years at the airport, using a compound that would eventually cause organ failure while appearing to be natural aging. Only Thunder's exceptional constitution and the gradual nature of the poisoning had kept him alive long enough to expose the network. The children's testimonies, delivered while maintaining contact with Thunder, revealed the systematic nature of their abuse. They'd been told their families had died, that they were orphans lucky to be chosen for placement with loving adoptive parents. The psychological conditioning had been sophisticated and thorough, designed to create grateful compliance rather than obvious trauma that might alert authorities. As the compound was secured and evidence cataloged, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Dr. Vasquez hadn't been operating alone. She'd been the American coordinator for an international network that supplied children to wealthy clients across 3 continents. The operation had been protected by corruption at every level, from local law enforcement to federal agencies, sustained by the enormous profits generated by human trafficking. The most devastating revelation came when forensic accountants traced the money flow. Several of the families who'd purchased children had been prominent in child advocacy organizations, using their charitable work as cover for their crimes. Others held positions in law enforcement, education, and child protective services, creating a web of complicity that had made the network virtually undetectable. Thunder's role in exposing the conspiracy had been accidental but crucial. His emotional responses to trafficked children had provided the breakthrough that sophisticated surveillance and investigation had missed. The bull's trauma had become a detection system more sensitive than any technology, his grief a compass pointing toward hidden crimes. But the victory came with a price that Jake was only beginning to comprehend. The David he'd mourned for 12 years had grown into Daniel Patterson, a young man with no memory of his original family and no desire to reclaim a stolen identity. The reunion Jake had dreamed of would be a confrontation with a stranger who might see him as a threat to the only life he'd ever known. As federal agents prepared to transport the rescued children to specialized treatment facilities, Jake faced an impossible choice: push for immediate reunion with David, potentially traumatizing a young man who'd found peace in his stolen life, or respect the identity theft that Dr. Vasquez had orchestrated, allowing his son to remain lost to him forever. Thunder, exhausted from the emotional toll of returning to the site of his trauma, leaned heavily against Jake as they watched the children being led to safety. The bull's presence had been the key to their rescue, but Jake wondered whether the cost of that success would be the destruction of any chance for his family's healing. The compound that had hidden so much suffering was now a crime scene that would take months to process fully, but the real investigation was just beginning. With Dr. Vasquez in custody and her network exposed, the focus shifted to the hundreds of families who'd unknowingly or willingly participated in the trafficking of children. The legal battles ahead would determine whether justice could truly be served, or whether the powerful clients who'd fueled the demand for stolen children would escape consequences through wealth and influence. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on Friday, shattering what little sleep Jake had managed after the compound raid. Agent Chen's voice carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from delivering impossible news to broken families. "Jake, we've made contact with David. He goes by Daniel Patterson now, and he's agreed to meet with you. But there are complications." Jake sat up in the hospital chair where he'd been keeping vigil beside Thunder's recovery bed. The bull's condition had deteriorated rapidly after the emotional trauma of returning to the compound, and veterinary specialists were struggling to counteract years of slow poisoning combined with acute stress. Thunder's massive frame seemed diminished, his breathing labored, his usually alert eyes clouded with pain and exhaustion. "What kind of complications?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew the answer would destroy whatever hope he'd been clinging to. "Daniel doesn't remember you, Jake." The psychological conditioning was thorough, and he was young when it happened. More than that, he's angry. Dr. Vasquez convinced him that his biological parents were drug addicts who sold him to pay for their habits. He believes his adoptive family saved him from a life of abuse and neglect. The words hit Jake like physical blows. 12 years of grief, 12 years of guilt over failing to protect his son, and David had been taught to hate the father who'd never stopped searching for him. The cruel sophistication of Dr. Vasquez's psychological manipulation became clear. She hadn't just stolen children, she'd stolen their capacity to love the families they'd been taken from. Thunder stirred restlessly on his specialized bed, as if sensing Jake's anguish. The bull's condition had become critical during the night, his organs struggling against the accumulated damage from years of deliberate poisoning. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the large animal veterinarian who'd been working around the clock to save him, had been brutally honest about the prognosis. "The toxins have caused extensive liver and kidney damage," she'd explained earlier. "Combined with his age and the stress he's been under, his system is shutting down. We're doing everything we can, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that Thunder might not survive this." The irony was devastating. Thunder had finally succeeded in exposing the network that had traumatized him, had rescued the children he'd been unable to save years earlier, but the effort was killing him. The bull who'd spent 6 years trying to communicate what he'd witnessed was dying, just as the world finally understood what he'd been saying. Margaret and Harold had maintained their vigil alongside Jake, the three of them forming an unlikely family bound together by their love for the massive bull who'd given their lives meaning. Margaret had used her FBI contacts to expedite the investigation, while Harold's detailed records had provided crucial historical context for the prosecution. But now they could only watch helplessly as Thunder's life ebbed away. The meeting with David, Daniel, was scheduled for Saturday morning at a neutral location, with counselors present to mediate what everyone expected to be a traumatic encounter. Jake had been warned repeatedly that pushing too hard for emotional connection could damage Daniel's psychological stability, that the young man had built his identity around the belief that his adoptive family had rescued him from terrible circumstances. "He's a good kid," Agent Chen had assured Jake. "Graduated high school with honors, working on his family's ranch, engaged to be married. The Pattersons genuinely love him, and he loves them. This isn't a case of obvious abuse. It's a case of stolen identity that created genuine bonds with the wrong people." But as Friday night stretched into Saturday morning, Jake realized he might lose Thunder before ever getting the chance to see David again. The bull's breathing had become increasingly labored, and his responses to stimuli were weakening. Dr. Martinez had assembled a team of specialists, but they were fighting damage that had been accumulating for years. At 5:23 a.m., Thunder's condition suddenly worsened. Alarms sounded as his vital signs crashed, and the veterinary team sprang into action with emergency interventions. Jake found himself pushed back against the wall, watching helplessly as medical professionals fought to save the partner who'd become his entire world. "His kidneys are failing," Dr. Martinez announced grimly. "We can put him on dialysis, but at his size and with the extent of the damage, it's essentially life support. He's suffering, Jake. You need to consider whether prolonging this is fair to him." The impossible choice crystallized with brutal clarity. Thunder was dying, had been dying slowly for years while Dr. Vasquez's poison accumulated in his system. The bull had used the last of his strength to save the children he'd been unable to protect as a younger animal, and now he was paying the ultimate price for his heroism. Margaret took Jake's hand as he stared at Thunder's labored breathing. "He did what he came here to do," she said softly. "He saved them all, including you. Maybe it's time to let him rest." Outside, dawn was breaking over Dallas, and somewhere in Montana, a young man named Daniel Patterson was preparing to meet the father he'd been taught to despise, never knowing that the bull who'd exposed his kidnapping was fighting for every breath in a veterinary hospital hundreds of miles away. The decision to transport Thunder to the meeting location defied every medical recommendation, but Jake couldn't bear the thought of Daniel, never understanding what the bull had sacrificed to find him. Dr. Martinez agreed to the risky journey only because Thunder's condition had temporarily stabilized and because she recognized that some bonds transcend medical protocol. The specialized veterinary transport arrived at the Neutral Meeting Facility, a family counseling center in Fort Worth, with Thunder hooked to portable life support systems. His massive frame filled the custom trailer, but his eyes still held the gentle intelligence that had made him extraordinary. Margaret and Harold rode alongside, their presence providing continuity for an animal who'd lost so much already. Daniel Patterson stepped out of a pickup truck with Montana plates, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. At 20 years old, David had grown into a lean, weathered young man who moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His hair was still the same sandy brown Jake remembered, but everything else had changed. This was a stranger wearing his son's face, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a rancher who'd never known doubt about his place in the world. The initial meeting took place in the counseling center's main room with Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in reunification therapy, facilitating the conversation. Daniel sat rigidly across from Jake, his body language radiating skepticism and barely controlled anger. Behind them, through large windows, Thunder lay in his trailer like a dying monument to everything that had been lost and found. "I want to be clear about something," Daniel said, his voice carrying a slight Montana drawl that Jake had never heard before. "The Pattersons are my family. They raised me, loved me, gave me everything I needed. Whatever biological connection we might have doesn't change that." Jake nodded, fighting back tears at hearing David's voice after 12 years of silence. "I understand. I'm not here to take you away from the life you've built. I just need you to know the truth about what happened, about why you disappeared." Dr. Williams guided them through the basic facts: the kidnapping, the staged car accident, the systematic psychological conditioning that had convinced Daniel his birth parents were criminals who'd sold him. With each revelation, Daniel's composure cracked slightly, confusion replacing certainty. "That's impossible," Daniel insisted. I remember being scared, but Dr. Vasquez explained that my parents were dangerous people. She showed me police reports about drug arrests, domestic violence. She was protecting me. Jake pulled out the file Agent Chen had compiled. Photographs of David as a child, family videos, medical records proving their relationship. The evidence was overwhelming, but Daniel stared at it as if looking at artifacts from someone else's life. "I don't remember any of this," he said quietly. "If what you're saying is true, then everything I believed about myself is a lie." That's when Dr. Williams suggested they visit Thunder. The Bull's role in exposing the trafficking network had been explained, but Daniel hadn't yet understood the personal connection. As they approached the trailer, Thunder's massive head lifted slightly, his clouded eyes focusing with effort on the young man who'd once been a child he'd tried to protect. The recognition was instantaneous and heartbreaking. Thunder made a sound Jake had never heard before, a deep, gentle rumble that seemed to come from the very core of his being. It wasn't the mournful calling of trauma, but something older and deeper, the sound of a protector greeting someone he'd never stopped loving. Daniel froze at the sound, his hand flying to his chest as if something had physically struck him. "I know that sound," he whispered. "I remember. There was a big cow who used to comfort us when we were scared. He would make that exact sound." The memories came flooding back with devastating force. Daniel collapsed to his knees beside the trailer, his adult composure crumbling as childhood trauma broke through years of careful conditioning. "Oh God," he sobbed. "I remember now. The barn, the other children being so scared. And he was there, trying to protect us." Thunder managed to extend his massive head through the trailer's opening, and Daniel reached out with trembling hands to touch the bull's muzzle. The contact triggered a complete emotional breakdown, as suppressed memories of his kidnapping and captivity overwhelmed him. Jake moved to comfort his son, but Daniel pulled away, too overwhelmed to process the reunion. "I remember you," Daniel whispered to Thunder. "You tried to keep us safe. You were the only good thing in that place." His voice broke completely. "I forgot you. They made me forget you." The revelation of Thunder's deteriorating condition added another layer of tragedy to the reunion. Daniel learned that the bull who'd protected him as a child was dying from the same poison that had been meant to silence his testimony. The animal, who'd spent 6 years trying to lead authorities back to trafficked children, was paying the ultimate price for his loyalty. Over the next several hours, with Dr. Williams's guidance, Daniel began processing the truth about his kidnapping. The psychological conditioning had been sophisticated and thorough, but it couldn't withstand the evidence of Thunder's recognition and his own recovered memories. Slowly, painfully, David began emerging from within Daniel's constructed identity. The most devastating revelation came when Daniel realized how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. Dr. Vasquez hadn't just stolen his childhood. She'd stolen his capacity to trust his own memories, his ability to distinguish between reality and the fiction she'd constructed. Every happy memory with the Pattersons now carried the weight of knowing it was built on a foundation of lies. "How do I reconcile this?" Daniel asked Dr. Williams. "The Pattersons love me genuinely. They didn't know I was stolen, but their entire relationship with me is based on a crime. How do I continue loving people who unknowingly participated in destroying my original family?" Jake found himself in the impossible position of comforting the son who'd been taught to hate him. "You don't have to choose," he said carefully. "The Pattersons gave you 12 years of love and stability. That's real, even if the beginning was wrong. I don't want to take that away from you." But Daniel was struggling with more than just competing loyalties. The recovered memories of his trafficking and the other children's suffering had awakened survivor's guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. He'd been one of the lucky ones, placed with a loving family, given opportunities, allowed to build a successful life. How many other children had suffered worse fates while he'd forgotten they'd ever existed? Thunder's presence provided the emotional anchor that allowed Daniel to begin processing these impossible contradictions. The bull's unconditional acceptance, his obvious joy at their reunion despite his own suffering, offered a model for how love could transcend trauma and betrayal. As the day progressed, Daniel made a decision that surprised everyone. He asked to stay with Thunder through the night, camping in the trailer with the dying bull who'd never stopped trying to save him. The veterinary team set up monitoring equipment, but Daniel insisted on providing the hands-on comfort that machines couldn't offer. Jake watched his son, he could think of him as David again now, gently stroking Thunder's massive head while whispering apologies for forgetting, for not understanding, for being unable to save the animal who'd sacrificed everything to save him. The reunion Jake had dreamed of for 12 years was happening in the shadow of loss, complicated by competing loyalties and the approaching death of the being who'd made it possible. Margaret and Harold joined the vigil, creating a circle of protection around Thunder and the young man he'd never stopped loving. The bull's breathing was labored but steady, as if he was drawing strength from finally completing the mission that had sustained him through years of trauma and service. "He waited for this," Margaret said softly, watching Thunder's peaceful expression as Daniel maintained contact with him. "He couldn't let go until he knew you were safe." As midnight approached, Thunder's vital signs began the final decline that Dr. Martinez had warned them to expect. But surrounded by the family he'd chosen and the child he'd protected, the massive bull faced his end with the dignity that had defined his entire life. The resolution Jake had hoped for was more complex than he'd imagined, but it was real. David was alive, the trafficking network was destroyed, and Thunder's sacrifice had meaning that would echo through generations of children who would never know how close they'd come to similar fates. Thunder passed away at 3:17 a.m. on Sunday morning, his massive heart finally succumbing to the accumulated damage from years of deliberate poisoning. But he didn't die alone. David held one massive hoof in his hands while Jake stroked the bull's neck. Margaret whispered prayers, and Harold hummed an old lullaby from his own childhood. The veterinary monitors showed the moment when Thunder's suffering ended, but his face held an expression of peace that spoke of a mission finally completed. David's breakdown was immediate and complete. The young man who'd spent 12 years as Daniel Patterson sobbed with a grief that encompassed not just Thunder's death, but the gradual understanding of everything he'd lost and everyone who'd never stopped loving him. Jake held his son for the first time in 12 years, both of them crying for the bull who'd brought them back together and the childhood that could never be recovered. The funeral arrangements became a community effort that reflected Thunder's impact on everyone who'd known him. The airport authority, facing public pressure and genuine remorse for their earlier termination plans, offered to fund a memorial that would honor Thunder's service. But the outpouring of support extended far beyond Dallas. Donations came from around the world as Thunder's story spread, creating a fund that would eventually support anti-trafficking efforts in his name. Margaret took charge of organizing the service, her FBI background proving invaluable in coordinating with federal agencies, media outlets, and the hundreds of people who wanted to pay their respects. The ceremony took place at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, in a specially designated area where Thunder had spent 6 years protecting travelers who never knew they were being watched over by a bull with a broken heart and an unbreakable spirit. Emma Collins, now speaking freely and showing remarkable resilience for a 4-year-old trauma survivor, insisted on placing flowers on Thunder's custom-built casket. "Mumu saved us all," she told the assembled crowd with the simple clarity that only children possess. Her words became the unofficial motto for the Thunder Foundation, established to continue his work of protecting vulnerable children. The legal proceedings that followed Dr. Vasquez's arrest revealed the full scope of the trafficking network's reach. Prosecutions extended across multiple states and countries, with Thunder's behavioral evidence playing a crucial role in securing convictions. His unique ability to detect trafficked children was studied by animal behaviorists and law enforcement agencies, leading to new training protocols for service animals in similar roles. David faced the complex challenge of rebuilding relationships with two families who both loved him genuinely. The Pattersons, devastated by learning they'd unknowingly participated in human trafficking, initially wanted to step back from David's life entirely. But his insistence that their love for him had been real, regardless of its criminal origins, helped them navigate the impossible emotional terrain. The solution they found wasn't perfect, but it was workable. David split his time between Montana and Texas, maintaining his life with the Pattersons while rebuilding his relationship with Jake. The ranch work he'd learned in Montana proved invaluable when Jake used part of the Thunder Foundation's donations to purchase land where they could establish a sanctuary for rescued animals and a treatment facility for trafficking survivors. Margaret's transformation from janitor to security consultant seemed almost surreal, but her FBI background and her years of informal investigation made her uniquely qualified to design new protocols for detecting human trafficking in transportation hubs. Her work with Thunder had taught her to recognize patterns that traditional security measures missed, and she developed training programs that were adopted by airports internationally. Harold Wilson found renewed purpose in his role as the Thunder Foundation's official historian. His meticulous records, maintained over decades of observing airport patterns, became the foundation for academic studies on long-term trafficking operations. Universities invited him to lecture on the importance of institutional memory and the value of listening to observations from experienced workers. The rescued children faced varying challenges in their recovery. Some, like Emma, proved remarkably resilient with proper support. Others required years of therapy to overcome the sophisticated psychological conditioning they'd endured. The Thunder Foundation established specialized treatment programs that incorporated animal-assisted therapy, recognizing the unique comfort that animals could provide to trauma survivors. Dr. Vasquez's trial became a landmark case in human trafficking prosecution. Her detailed records, maintained with clinical precision, provided prosecutors with unprecedented insight into the operation of international trafficking networks. The evidence was so comprehensive that she ultimately accepted a plea agreement, receiving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in exchange for cooperation that led to dozens of additional arrests. The families who'd unknowingly purchased trafficked children faced a legal and moral minefield. Some, like the Pattersons, had genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate adoption procedures. Others had been willfully blind to obvious red flags in their eagerness to obtain children. The courts struggled to balance justice with the reality that many of these children had formed genuine bonds with their adoptive families. David's decision to publicly forgive the Pattersons while acknowledging the crime they'd unknowingly participated in became a model for other families navigating similar situations. His testimony about the genuine love he'd received, combined with his clear understanding that love couldn't excuse the underlying crime, helped courts develop frameworks for addressing these complex cases. The Thunder Memorial at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport became an unexpected pilgrimage site for families affected by trafficking, law enforcement professionals, and animal lovers who understood the profound bond between Thunder and the humans he'd served. The bronze statue depicted Thunder in his prime, alert and protective, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Thunder, who heard the cries of the voiceless and never stopped fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves." Jake's healing proved to be a gradual process complicated by guilt, grief, and the challenge of building a relationship with a son who was essentially a stranger. But David's patience and Thunder's example provided a foundation for their recovery. Working together on the sanctuary gave them shared purpose and the opportunity to honor Thunder's memory through service to others. The broader impact of Thunder's story extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Animal rights organizations used his example to advocate for expanded recognition of animal intelligence and emotional capacity. Law enforcement agencies worldwide began incorporating animal behavioral training into their human trafficking detection programs. Child advocacy groups used Thunder's story to illustrate the importance of listening to witnesses who couldn't speak for themselves. Emma Collins, now safe with her biological aunt who'd never stopped searching for her, maintained a special relationship with the Thunder Foundation. Her recovery became a symbol of hope for other trafficking survivors, and her annual visits to Thunder's memorial reminded everyone that his sacrifice had prevented countless other children from suffering similar fates. As the first anniversary of Thunder's death approached, the Foundation announced plans for a national conference on animal-assisted law enforcement, with proceeds supporting both anti-trafficking efforts and animal welfare programs. The event would bring together survivors, law enforcement professionals, animal behaviorists, and families who'd been affected by trafficking. David, now comfortable using his original name while maintaining his Montana identity as Daniel, spoke at the conference about the unique healing power of animals in trauma recovery. His relationship with Jake had evolved into something neither father nor son had expected. Not a recreation of their original bond, but something new built on mutual respect and shared loss. The legacy Thunder left behind wasn't just in the children he'd helped rescue or the network he'd exposed, but in the proof that love and loyalty could transcend species, that intelligence and compassion could overcome systematic evil, and that sometimes the most important voices belonged to those who couldn't speak human words. Standing beside Thunder's memorial on that first anniversary, surrounded by the community of survivors, investigators, and friends who'd become his family, Jake finally understood what Margaret had meant when she'd said Thunder had waited to complete his mission. The bull hadn't just been trying to save trafficked children. He'd been trying to save everyone who'd been broken by trauma, everyone who'd lost faith in the possibility of justice. Everyone who needed to remember that love could survive even the worst human cruelty. Thunder's story became a reminder that heroes often come in unexpected forms, that the smallest voices sometimes carry the most important messages, and that the bonds formed through shared trauma and mutual service can heal wounds that seemed impossible to close. Dear friends, Thunder's story reminds us that in life's golden years, we often discover our greatest purpose isn't behind us. It's still unfolding. Like Margaret, who transformed from a lonely widow into a respected security expert, or Harold, whose decades of quiet observations became the key to saving lives, we seniors possess wisdom and experience that the world desperately needs. Thunder, an aging bull facing forced retirement, proved that being expensive or outdated doesn't diminish our worth, it often enhances it. His 6 years of patient service, dismissed by bureaucrats as costly inefficiency, turned out to be the most valuable investment in countless children's lives. How many of us have felt pushed aside by a society that values youth over wisdom, efficiency over experience? Thunder's tears weren't just for trafficked children. They were for everyone who's been told they no longer matter. His legacy shows us that our accumulated knowledge, our ability to notice patterns others miss, our capacity for unconditional love, these aren't burdens to be managed but gifts to be treasured. Sometimes the most important contributions come from those society considers past their prime, proving that age brings not limitation but liberation to love without reservation. What experiences from your past could be the key to helping someone today? When have you felt overlooked but later discovered your true value? Share your stories below. Your wisdom matters more than you know.